I'm assuming there's going to be a number of questions. So the process will be as follows. We have some people will be handing around microphones, so if you want to put up a hand and raise a question, it would be great if you could target the question to a particular individual. If the other panelists have things to say, they'll add to it, but it's going to be a little bit more efficient, I think, if we can focus the question. So ask the question of whoever you want to answer, and we'll go from there. Questions?
Hi, this one's going to be directed to Leanne. Have you got a process in place for synthesizing or theming, or what are you going to do with all of that wonderful input, some of which I have also gone in and read, and I found it a wonderful learning experience for myself, but back to you, I'm sure that's going to be a challenge to try to see how is this going to fit or be synthesized.
Sure. We decided not to do a what we heard report, mostly because we weren't actually in the room to hear most of the conversation, so it felt kind of weird to do a what we heard report. So we took, and we had such a huge volume of data. We had over 10,000 records of data that came into us. So we just did qualitative analysis using grounded theory to kind of mine our way through all that data. We unfortunately did not have access to the tools that would make that job really easy. And so there are some analysts here who were very unhappy. It was very quiet in our office for many weeks while they come in all cheery, hi everyone, everyone would be like. So we mined our way through that data, and then for each of the sections we just said, here's what we have analyzed, here's what we think you said to us, and then we published it in reports and then put it back out. What is funny is that, and we included some quotes in the summing up report, right, Roya? There were a few quotes from people, but not in the same way that may have been you've seen government do in the past. We didn't do that, and then we published all the raw data back out and said, here it is, all cleaned up. If you want to do this yourself, you're welcome to do it and see if you get different results than us. So that was our general approach. And we've heard from folks that we did not a bad job of matching the second version of the feedback to what we put in the summing up document. But we all have also heard that we got to go back and just tighten up some areas where they didn't feel we were aligned enough.
This question is for Fiona. You mentioned random versus targeted in terms of recruiting. I'm wondering if you have any further thoughts on the pros and cons of random versus targeted and figuring out when maybe you have that balance right. I mean, I realize it's a big question and it's a challenging problem, but I think that Peter talked about randomness as well this morning, and there's a fair amount of research literature on that, so I'm wondering if your organization is involved in research, if you've discovered anything related to that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and I think where it's critical that the diversity of people involved have no vested interest or a peered sense of, sort of skin in the game already, I think it's really, really important to do random selection where, it really is a bringing together of a diverse group of people without any already vested interest potentially, depending on the topic. So I think it is really important in that sense to have random recruitment. And also I think in terms of the targeted recruitment, I think where you do, again, want to really ensure that you're working to, and as was mentioned across many of us, involve people that are not necessarily usually involved in these kinds of conversations about certain issues, where then you need to make an extra effort to ensure that those folks are brought into the conversation, and then when they are brought into the conversation, that there's a lot of effort done to support them in different ways, whatever that looks like. But I think it's important, depending on the topic involved, to have both. But I do highly think there is challenges of, bringing a group of randomly selected people into a room and what that means and the kinds of design and resources you need in place to make that effective.
Thanks everyone for some very interesting presentations. I'm going to be involved in some stakeholder engagement in a particular region of Alberta where there has been extensive engagement and consultation occurring already, and I'm concerned about this concept of consultation fatigue, so to speak, and trying to bring the same people to the table but on different issues. And we are trying to align our efforts with another framework that's on the ground and going to be engaging some of those similar stakeholders. But you have, and this goes to the whole panel, do you have any recommendations to minimize that sort of sense where we're trying to target those same people all the time, and where we want to maintain that enthusiasm and that sense of civic democracy and that wanting to participate?
Margaret, you?
It's a problem, and you run into it, in terms of the mood of the room when you go into the room and they're starting from either a cynical place or a negative place. Maybe just a couple of things about that. I think it's important to tell people, if they've been engaged before, clearly what happened with what they contributed before, and show where this next discussion picks up on what was and goes somewhere else. I think you have to show them where they are in a continuum of discussion. I mean, otherwise they just feel they're being brought back and back and back, and they don't see the link between the previous conversation and the current one. One of the things you often hear when you go out and talk to groups out there is, and I'm just repeating what I hear, they say, doesn't the government of Alberta, for example, know they talked to us 3 months ago? Or how does this department talk to us about this? When they want some sense of how the pieces fit inside, and they're not just being run around the same table. So I think if you can, at the front end, provide perspective on the integration across the GOA, on the previous discussion and how it connects with this discussion, and some sense of progress in all of these discussions, just a small contribution to your question.
In terms of, particularly in smaller communities, I don't know where your engagement will be happening, but in smaller communities, people wear many hats, and it is often the same person with completely different issues needing to be engaged. And we have seen that coalitions, again, have played a positive role in that, they're flexible in terms of the topic. I talked about the early years, but if something comes up that's going to affect our community, it affects everybody. And so they have been used as, again, a vehicle to either connect with the people that they need to be engaged with or be a part of those conversations too.
I guess I would just add that I think sometimes that consultation fatigue comes out from the fact they may have participated in consultations with expectations that weren't aligned with the objectives of the engagement. Mm-hmm. And that may be at the fault of the engager or the engagee. We had to engage with First Nations people, and they are a population that feels extremely fatigued by consultation and by the lack of results. Like, we've told you that we need these things. We still don't have these things. How many times do you want us to tell you? So our approach to that was just acknowledging that was a problem right up front with them, to say, well, we know we get it. And this is what we're going to talk about here, and that this is what this is going to do. It's not going to change. We're not going to deal with jurisdictional issues in this conversation. So that they were really, so when we went to the Grand Chiefs and we went to the leadership and we went to those communities, they knew, okay, this is the scope and this is what you're going to use it for, which I think helped them feel more confident in the participation. Because I think just sometimes I think for that population, they have been over-engaged for good reason in many cases, but they don't feel like there's any results for that.
Thank you. Leanne, you mentioned that Minister Hancock wanted to finish something that he started. And that's one thing that I find it challenging as a practitioner to be able to initiate, go through, and conclude with the same set of decision makers. Mm-hmm. So finding that sweet spot in between red zones of elections and a deputy minister shuffle or a cabinet minister shuffle can be incredibly challenging. Mm-hmm. So I can see how you can plan a process from beginning to end, but actually implementing it through those changes is challenging. So I wonder if any of you could comment on how you've managed changing leadership.
I can say I've been at this a while in Alberta, a fair amount in the public sector. And even though, if you take, for example, the fact we had these discussions on the health legislation in 2010, there has been a change in minister. I've got to say, and I've done some work in that department over a number of years, some of what comes out of these consultations lives underneath and around all of the change. Some of the concepts that surface in these, if you're having them at a high policy level, there may be a bit of backing up and starting over, but if you look around what surfaced in those discussions around patient-focused and patient and people first, if you look around the discussion around primary health care and some of the key things that had to happen to make that move forward. If some of them, you may not see a direct line result within that initiative and within that program, but it does take on a life of its own. If you look at the social policy framework discussion, for example, some of that came up when the government started to talk about being able to take a citizens focus where in the human services sector, which wasn't even a department then, they could have more of a seamless transition between programs. And as they began to work through that, they began to think, well, wait a minute, what's some of the overarching policy under which we would do this? And so I know the leadership changes. I don't think any of us can change the political world or the political cycles, but if the result of the engagement begins to get root at a policy level, it can help inform the new person, and it can take on a bit of a life of its own. It's very frustrating to live with that change. I understand that, but some of it does, I would say, from just what I've been around for 25 years, some of it does take root and gets passed along.
I'll just add that taking root in policy is important, and at the same time taking root in community, and where there's some community ownership, that it's community that ride out government changes and that kind of thing, and become more proactive, knowing that changes might happen. So I think there's value in that too.
Leanne, this is a question for you. I think clearly you have a unique minister. And I guess one of the things that I think that I've been struggling with over time is that, as we do stakeholder engagement, there's a political process that operates as well. And we're all aware of how that works. And it's, stakeholders have ample opportunity and should take advantage of that opportunity to engage through that political process. But certainly the concern sometimes is and my question, I won't ramble further, is basically, did you find that the social policy framework processes that you used, and perhaps the fact that you've got Dave Hancock as your minister, meant that your stakeholders were more engaged with staying in the process? Did you have more or less people sort of needing to feel like they had to represent their vested interest to the minister, or not?
I will say that our strategy of posting every letter on the website and every official submission that comes in has an impact, right? Because by doing that and by throwing it way out in the open, those backdoor conversations that may occur from time to time, and they're a reality, they're going to happen, right? That they kind of lose their steam a little bit, because that the official submission is going to be posted on the website and everyone's going to read it. So, and he was we proposed that to him, and he thought, okay, he saw it as an advantage for him to help just keep that transparency up. So I don't, and he's had some of his own meetings, and he's to gather input that's not necessarily in the public forum, and that's his prerogative as a minister to do that, right? So in many cases we haven't been involved in that, and he's done those on his own. But I think that I think some stakeholders are going to do both ways. The challenge is really to balance off their point of view with other folks' points of view, to make sure that you're not just hearing from one stakeholder group. And so we were very deliberate to try to make sure that those groups who don't often get a voice had opportunity to provide feedback and input and have a voice. So I don't think that's necessarily a clear answer. And, you know, it may have been different with a different minister. I'm not in a different deputy in a different context. But within the context we had, he was very keen on, let's open the doors, right? Let's open drapes. And everyone can come in and take a look at how ugly policymaking is, right? Come on in. So I think, you know, we were very fortunate that he was and he's so comfortable and confident. He has a lot of experience, right? So he's very confident and comfortable with that process.
In terms of public engagement, one of the key dimensions that you cannot ignore is culture. And I think I would like to hear from you in terms of whether public engagement is a culturally neutral process or not.
I would say it absolutely is not culturally neutral. If you're going into certain cultural environments, you have to accept what you do and do not understand and find a means of engaging that community within their cultural context. And that may be, as you've said and you've indicated, giving some of that away to others who are part of that community and can engage that community within their cultural context. But to ensure it's not a talking at, it's a talking with, and it's truly engaged. Culture is such a critical part of the nature of that dynamic that you have to find ways to acknowledge it, respect it, engage within it, even if it means that giving away of who's, you know, and it doesn't matter who kind of owns the process. It's who's best able to connect with that community in culturally respectful ways.
We have a process within our ministry that is tangential to the social policy framework, connected but separate, and about engaging First Nations communities in a conversation about the number of children in care. And I think what they have done, and it's not as if we haven't tried to have a conversation about the overrepresentation of First Nation kids in care, but I don't think we have not gone as far as we have beyond kind of, we just need a culturally competent assessment tool, you know, that kind of conversation, which doesn't seem to root out the problem. So what they've done is they've been very deliberate about embedding it, that entire conversation, in First Nation cultural practices. So, you know, they spent a lot of time with the chiefs, getting their okay. Then they went to the elders and spent a tremendous amount of time with elders. And then and only then opened up for a community conversation. But even inside that community conversation, it was still embedded in cultural principles specific to First Nations communities in terms of how the dialogue went, who participated, how you participated. And so they, I think, have had some success. I agree. I don't think you can have anything called, in this day and age, I don't think there's any such thing as culturally neutral. If you really want meaningful, it can be if you're only interested in informing, sure. But if you're really interested in deep understanding and deep dialogue, you have to be culturally relevant, and that means you've got to, and you may not be the expert.
One really quick thing. I want to be sure we understand cultural not meaning an ethnic orientation,
right.
Or it's
Yes.
much deeper than that.
Yeah.
When we did the family violence and bullying roundtables a number of years ago, we went in and talked to convicted people serving time, and that was a culture and had to be approached with a cultural sensitivity.
I think people come to engagement places or opportunities very much with all of their cultural background, and I think good deliberative and good public engagement also creates opportunities to allow for dialogue and discussion that really brings out different cultural perspectives, experiences, and brings that into the dialogue and allows people creates a structure and opportunity for people to share and acknowledge and understand that.
There seems to be a consensus across the panel that public engagement is a good thing and has positive outcomes and benefits. What about the sustainability of the approach and the embedding of the approach into ongoing governance, which is linked to sustainability? I'd be interested in comments of any of the panel members who wish to.
I'll start because ours is a funded kind of approach and has been for the last decade. And it's really, maybe it's semantics, but a value in public engagement, but more public participation and learning together and making decisions together. And it all boils down to relationships, particularly in long-term approaches. And we have had conversations that, you know, if the funding goes, we're still together. We have these relationships. Our networks are really strong. The momentum will certainly slow down. Hard to get things done when there isn't a dedicated person to go have one-on-one conversations or uncover information or do that knowledge translation. But I think that given the investment of it, which has been a fairly small investment given the number of people involved in, I think there's 1,800 people in BC that are actively on some kind of coalition, which leverages thousands of volunteers outside of that as well. So with a little bit of time, those have started and they have taken root. But I think if there wasn't, well, just recently there was a reduction in funding, shifting a little bit, and coalitions got together and was a great example of that ownership. And like, okay, well, we're just going to have to do things differently because this is what we want to get done. But that doesn't happen overnight. That happens after a decade.
It's a good thing, even if it's just a one-off, to have engaged people in the decision. A lot it may make a difference the type of initiative that you're looking at. You know, is it decision making? Is it, you know, the whole spectrum that you see in the IP2 stuff? But I would say what really matters is that politics are changing. The whole environment in which engagement takes place is accelerating. Expectations of people for more contribution and participation and engagement and communication and collaboration wherever you are along the spectrum is rising. Technology is driving some of that. Politicians may be only becoming alert to it now, but they are. That there is a bigger movement underway that will make it harder and harder to be making decisions without more and more engaged connections in advance of those. You know, you can see it, you can measure it. If you pull back and look at it from 30,000 feet and not 3, you can see there's a lot of forces at play here. I think there's an inevitability to how it's affecting politics, public policy, public decision making, and you know, I think that's why these forums are important. But I think there is something broader underway that we should keep an eye on.
I also think just having resources and structures for long-term research and learning helps to embed and institutionalize engagement. That if there is, say, like the center that is trying to capture across projects and support both city and university to capture learning and to think even about the question of institutionalization, but you need resources and people dedicated to, and also the mechanisms to have long-term learning. I think that's one part of it as well, and I think frameworks and policies also help that as well.
I would just add, because we're just in the middle of trying to think through sustainability. When we started with the wiki, we highlighted to our executive and to the government that you can't turn a wiki off, right? You can't just say, oh, we're all done, thanks, see you later. This doesn't work that way. And so, you know, part of what we're thinking about is that a lot of people who are deeply involved may slide back to the inform awareness part of the continuum. But that you have to think there are people who want to be more deeply engaged. Mm-hmm. And so the trick is to find a way to keep them deeply engaged. Mm-hmm. But recognize that not everybody wants to be part of all the conversation all the time, right? So they're going to slide back. So for us, I think we're just in the process of thinking, so how do we do that? How do we let people slide back and still get what they need? And that for the folks who want to be deeply engaged in a conversation about social policy, how do we give them that opportunity in a way that's meaningful and useful for us and for them? And so I always go back to my kind of old, when I worked at one point in community development, it's kind of that idea, right? It's kind of old community development kind of methodology about how do you keep, some people go away and then they come back when it's important to them. So I think we have to give ourselves a break a little bit on that some people are just going to go away. That's okay, they'll come back.